Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, Data Privacy Exposure and the Cyber Threat Landscape by our speaker, John Grimm. I'm Shilpa and I'll be your host for the day. For our attendees, the session will be in listen-only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to organizers or panelists, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any video challenges, please check your internet connections or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for certificate of attendance. You need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. Also, participants should fill in the survey form which will be sent in the attendees thank you email and answer correctly the 3 multiple choice questions based on the webinar. The certificate of attendance shall be sent to you within next 5 to 7 working days after the event. Now about our speaker. John Grimm has led data breaches and cybersecurity incidents investigations within the government and civilian security sectors for over 19 years. John has served 12 years with the US Army as counterintelligence special agent investigating security incidents. He currently leads the research development and innovation effort of the VERIS Threat Research Advisory Center, VTRAC, as a distinguished architect. His job profile was always focused on investigating cybersecurity incidents, participating in digital forensic examinations, rendering consultancy on data breach containment and eradication efforts, and developing response preparedness, training, and breach simulation exercises for customers worldwide. Now, without any further delay, I would now hand over the session to our speaker.
Thank you, Shilpa. As Shilpa indicated, my name is John Grimm with the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center. So welcome to today's presentation. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, folks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So let's set the table first and foremost in terms of data privacy. So we'll be talking about data privacy exposure in the cyber threat landscape. But as you can see here, just as an example, these are some data privacy law examples that have been enacted by various entities across the world, such as Europe, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. In the United States here, we've got various different laws and acts in place. As you can see, HIPAA, FCRA, FERPA, and GLBA. And then if you want to drill down further here in the United States, some of the states here have actually enacted laws such as CCPA, VCDPA, and COLOPA in terms of privacy. So this is just an example of some of the data privacy laws out there. As we continue to go forth, we can imagine that there's going to be more GDPR-like laws that are enacted for various different countries as well as regions in the world. So what does this mean in terms of data privacy exposure? Well, first and foremost, what we did with the data breach investigations report data set here with Verizon is we queried 3 years of data breaches from the 2018 to the 2020 timeframe to get an understanding of what's happening out there with data privacy exposure. So we're looking at 5,180 privacy breaches in that 3-year timeframe. Confirmed breaches are 100% confidentiality impacted. So if you're a fan of the data breach investigations report, which are at 14 years in terms of the making of that report, you'll understand that if we have a data breach, confidentiality of the CIA triad is affected at 100% of the time. Now, the CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we're looking at a 3-year time frame of those confirmed data breaches involving privacy information. So what is privacy information in terms of what the VTRAC team and the DBIR team look at? What's personal data, your PII, personally identifiable information. It's medical data in terms of medical data, or more specifically, protected health information, PHI. Banking, your financial data, such as your account information. Payment data, such as PCI, payments card industry, PCI data from your credit cards, and credentials in terms of privacy information. So we're looking at those 5 data elements when we're looking at defining privacy within the data breach investigations report data set. We're also going to talk today from the standpoint of understanding the data privacy exposure from the standpoint of the VERIS A4 threat model, the vocabulary for event recording and incident sharing, A4 threat model, and I'll talk about those 4 A's shortly here. And in terms of countermeasures and controls, what you can do to prevent, mitigate, better detect, better respond to data privacy exposure breaches, we're going to talk about the CIS controls, or the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls. There's 18 of them. We're going to use version 8, which is the newest set of controls. So let's talk about the VERIS framework here before we get started in looking at the data set. So VERIS, as I indicated previously, is the vocabulary for event recording and incident sharing. It's a public framework. Anyone can use VERIS for codifying their breaches, their incidents. They can use VERIS for metrics. It's a common language for sharing information. It's how we collect the information for the Data Breach Investigations Report, or more simply, the DBIR. And then we go ahead and do the analysis based on how we collected the data through VERIS. So VERIS employs the A4 threat model, which is the actors, the actions, the assets, and the attributes. VERIS, it's really important when we look at the DBIR, today's data set as well, and VERIS in general looks at the totality of the incident, the totality of the breaches. So it's very much focused on what's happening all around in terms of the threat actors as well as the victims. We don't get too much into attribution per se. That's where we rely on the MITRE ATT&CK techniques, or the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And in terms of the countermeasures and controls, I'll talk about these shortly. We use the CIS controls. So VERIS is very much focused on the incident and the breach, and specifically the threat actors and the victims from the standpoint of what's happening. So the actors and the actions, those 2 A's for the A4 threat model within VERIS, explain or answer the questions of whose actions affected the asset and what actions affected the asset. So you can think of the standard grammar structure for English: subject, verb, object. The subject of this particular situation would be the actors. When we're looking at the verb, it would be the actions. And then the object, the predicate of the sentence, would be the assets and the attributes. Which assets were affected and how were assets affected? So this is very much focused on the victim piece for the last 2 A's, whereas the first 2 A's are focused on the actor piece. So that's VERIS, and that's the core component of VERIS, which is the A4 threat model. Now, if we're looking at the countermeasures and controls, we need to step outside of VERIS and look at the CIS controls, the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls, or simply put, the CIS controls. And we're looking here at version 8 of the controls. There's 18 controls total, okay? 18 of these with sub-controls underneath each one of these controls. For example, CIS1 would be your inventory and control of enterprise assets. So that's critical, or Center for Internet Security control number 1. So we'll talk about these throughout today's presentation. You'll see most of them listed on the left side of the slide. And at the end, we'll point out the key critical controls in terms of data privacy exposure. So let's go back to the definition of data. So within VERIS, confidentiality refers to limited observation and disclosure of an asset or data. When you lose confidentiality, implies that the data was actually observed or disclosed to an unauthorized actor rather than endangered, at risk, or potentially exposed. So the key here is unauthorized actor and exposure. So that actor could be internal to the organization, it could be a partner, it could be external to the organization, one of those 3 categories. And we've got 100% confirmation that that confidentiality was impacted, and thus we label that particular incident as a data breach. Okay, so we're showing confidentiality through the lens of compromised data varieties. And as you can see in the figure that's on the slide here, we're looking at 2020 DBIR data, and we're looking at those 5 different data elements that compose the privacy data within the DBIR: personal credentials, medical bank, and payment. We also have some internal data, as you can see there, at 2%. By far, when we're looking at privacy data, the number 1 data type, or data variety, I should say, is personal at 91%, 9 out of 10 times, and there's probably no surprise. But when we look at the other 4 components, credentials, we see that at 30%, medical at 19%, banking at 17%, and payment at 13%. We get a better idea of the privacy data because each one of those components has some element of privacy information involved with them. Credentials is your login ID, your password. Medical could be PII as well as PHI. Banking, again, is your account information, and payment is your PCI information. So let's look at patterns real quick before we get into the A4 threat model. So within the Data Breach Investigations report, we have 8 incident classification patterns that we've identified in terms of data breaches as well as cybersecurity incidents. So these 8 patterns comprise almost 100% of the breaches and almost 100% of the incidents, and it's true going back in time. So this year, we relooked those incident patterns, and these 8 are being shown right here. I've defined several of them on the left-hand side of your slide, okay? So starting from the top to the bottom, we've got basic web application attacks, which are simple web application attacks with a small number of steps. These are the non-complex web application attacks, such as disfiguring the website. When we go into the more complex web application attacks, that's where we get into system intrusions, where there's multiple steps. So first, basic web application attacks. Next, we have miscellaneous errors. So these are unintentional actions by actors that directly leads to a compromise of data. System intrusion, as I mentioned, are the more complex attacks. Social engineering are psychological compromise of a person. That's getting somebody to click on a hyperlink within an email or pre-texting someone. And then privilege misuse is abusing or misusing the privileges that were granted to a partner or an internal actor. So what you're seeing at the top of the, or the middle top of your screen is the 2020 timeframe in terms of patterns and privacy breaches. And at the bottom is the 3-year timeframe of 2018 to 2020. The N value, N equals, is the number of breaches that we had within that time frame. So for 2020, we had 2,271 privacy breaches. So the patterns breakdown within those privacy breaches, you can see for the most recent data set at the top is basic web application attacks 1 out of 3 times at 34%, followed by miscellaneous errors at 30%, and then system intrusion in terms of the top 3. When we look at the 3-year time frame, looking at 5,180 breaches, we see miscellaneous errors are at the top, statistically number 1 at 30%, followed by the basic web application attacks at 30%, and then the social engineering at 16%. So you can see a little bit of a shift here in terms of the most recent year versus 3 years, with basic web application attacks being at the top at 34%. Okay, so let's look at industries. So the dark orange, just if you haven't picked up on this, is the 3-year time frame. So right here, we're looking at industries compared to all breaches. So when we look at the top industries impacted by privacy breaches and all breaches, we see that healthcare in the 3-year time frame had 886 privacy-related breaches based on our data set, followed by financial at 814. Now that's just pure numbers. When we look at frequency, meaning the number of breaches out of, or the number of privacy breaches out of the total number of breaches per industry, we see a little bit of a different story. So at the bottom left, you'll see what I'm talking about. So top industries impacted by privacy breaches are entertainment at 81% of the time. So when we're looking at private or entertainment related data breaches, 8 out of 10 times there's a privacy component to those breaches. Accommodation, 80%, financial then at 75%, healthcare at 75%, and then finally real estate at 70%. So this gives you an idea of the breakdown by industry when it comes to privacy breaches. So let's look at a timeline. So first 2 timelines we'll look at are the timelines from the attacker standpoint, and then the next slide will be the timelines from the defender standpoint. So when we're looking at time to compromise and time to exfiltration, these are what the actors are doing. They're compromising the system, the data, the enterprise environment, and then they're exfiltrating the data from either the asset or the environment. Okay, so it's rather quick. We're talking minutes half the time for time to compromise, and we're talking minutes half the time for time to exfiltration for the threat actors. And then you can see it trails off from there. So the threat actors are rather quick when it comes to privacy breaches. This aligns a lot with what we see in overall data breaches in terms of the timeliness with the threat actors and their activities. They are rather quick. Key controls there: account management, malware defenses, and network monitoring and defense. Those are the 3 key controls from the sys controls. Now, when we look at timelines from the defender standpoint, it's a bit of a different story. Generally speaking, we're talking hours to months for time to discovery and hours to months for time to containment. Now, the peaks are at days at 32% and 47% respectively in terms of time to discovery. So that is still a bit longer than minutes when we're talking about the threat actor's activity. So a lot of damage can occur between the time to compromise and time to exfiltration versus time to discovery and the time to containment. So a lot of work needs to be done there in terms of discovery and getting better at detecting these breaches before they become fully fulfilled and keeping them at an incident or preferably even at an event level. Key controls on the bottom left there, controls 8, 10, 13, and 17. Okay, so let's look at the discovery a little bit closer in terms of not time to discovery, but the discovery method. So this is 2020 timeframe, looking at the most recent data that we have for the DBIR data set, and we're looking at the top discovery methods in breaches. So first and foremost, at 53% of the time, looking at 355 total privacy breaches, actor disclosure is the top discovery method. This is external to the organization. This is the threat actor who's disclosing that they have compromised privacy breach data. This could be as a breach that's involving ransomware, and the ransomware pop-up note is disclosing that there's a breach in general, and there's also privacy data that was exfiltrated as part of that breach. It could also be the actor that's contacting the victim organization and disclosing that they've breached the data exfiltrated and they're holding it for ransom. And it could also be an actor disclosure from the standpoint of a web forum, or I should say a dark web forum, where perhaps they're looking to sell that exfiltrated data or they're bragging about compromising a particular victim. So actor disclosure is number one. Interestingly, number 2, number 3, and number 4 are all external discovery methods. Security researchers at 19%, law enforcement at 8%, and customers at 6%. The top 4 are entities that are discovering breaches that are external to the victim organization. And then we finally get to an internal discovery method, which is reported by employee at 4%, and then we switch to external for fraud detection, unrelated third party, and then finally break-in discovery, which is also an internal discovery method at 1%. So we got to get better at discovering. Internal and partners should be discovering these breaches or discovering the incidents, or preferably discovering the events before they become an incident or breach. The quicker we are at discovering, the better we are at discovering, the more we can minimize the impact of privacy breaches. So VERIS A4 threat model. So the core component of VERIS is the A4 threat model, the actors, actions, assets, and attributes. Again, just as a review here, actors whose actions affected the asset, actions, what actions were affected in terms of the asset, assets, which assets were affected, and finally attributes, how were assets affected. Now I've got in parentheses here the number 3, 7, 5, and 3. This denotes the different categories that we have for each of the A's. So when you look at the VERIS framework as well as the DBIR, everything has a top level category, but we get more granular detail when we look at the varieties that fall within each category. Okay, so first and foremost, let's look into the actors first. Okay, first we're going to talk about motives, and then we're going to get into who the actors are. So here are the 3 categories for actors: external, partner, and internal. External actors do not have legitimate access to the data, the assets, of the environment. They are outside the building, or they're outside the enterprise environment. Internal actors have some level of trust and privilege to the data, the assets, the environment. They could be an end user, they could be a finance manager, they could be a system administrator, or they could be a developer. And we've got various different varieties of internal actors. These folks are not always nefarious in terms of their actions that lead to a breach. Of course, there's the insider threat who's misusing or abusing something that leads to a breach. There's also the insider threat who is misusing or abusing something to cut corners to get the job done, and it leads to a breach. So the first example would be someone who's malicious and stealing data. Okay, that's the insider threat everybody thinks of. But then there's also the person who's cutting corners to get the job done, it leads to a breach. And then there's also the internal actor who's committing an error, making a mistake, and it leads to a breach. They don't have a motive, right? They're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're misconfiguring something, for example, or they're misdelivering an email, and it leads to a breach. Partner actors are somewhere in between internal and external in terms of their trust and privilege. They have access to the environment, maybe remote access, but not full access. Okay, and as you see when we look at the breakdown here in a couple slides, external actors are by far the #1 actors that we need to worry about. So motives. All right. Motives and privacy breaches. So we're going to look at motives in overall actors, external, partner, and internal in the figure that you see at the top of your screen, looking at the 3-year time frame. So when we look at the motives, and you can see the definitions of motives on the left-hand side of your screen, Financial is the #1 driving force behind what the different threat actors are doing. 94% they're looking for financial gain by exfiltrating or compromising privacy data. And then you can see 2% is fun, espionage, and then 1% is convenience, and then grudge, and then ideology, respectively. Okay, so it's really by far we're looking at financially motivated threat actors. When we look at internal actors, these are, again, those folks that have been given some level of trust and privilege, and we look at their motives, it's a little bit different. It's still the same here in terms of financial being at the top, but financial really drops down to 66% of the time. So 2/3 of the breaches are financially motivated, but now we get into the fun at 16%. Now the fun is your fun, your curiosity, your pride. Curiosity would be exceeding your need to know, looking at patient records if you're not the attending physician, and therefore there's been a data compromise. So 16% fun is number 2. Convenience at 10%. This is, again, convenience, cutting corners just to get the job done. Grudge at 5%, and then espionage at 4%, other at 2%, and then fear and ideology at 1% apiece. So a little bit of a difference there when we look at internal actors. Keep in mind that a lot of those internal actors don't necessarily have a motive. They could be committing an error, a mistake, or misdelivery of an email, for example, that leads to a privacy breach. But we're only looking at motives in this particular case. Okay, so A, the first A, the noun of the sentence, the actors in privacy breaches. Okay, so this is the top level, the categories here that you're seeing. External actors are at #1 at 63%, internal at #2 at 37%, and partners are at 1%. Now, this is a little bit different than the overall data breaches in the DBIR. For example, in the DBIR, external actors are much more significant in terms of frequency than the internal actors. You can see internal actors here at 37%, which is significantly higher than the overall data breach data set in this year's DBIR. Now, when we look at the varieties, which is that one layer below the categories, looking at the 3-year time frame here, bottom of your screen, you can see external actor #1 is organized crime, which happens to be the overall actor variety. Okay, organized crime just happens to be external the way we code it at 59%. So 6 out of 10 times, or almost 2/3 of the time, it's an organized criminal element that's compromising privacy breaches. Next, we have internal at system administrator, which is our top internal active variety, our second highest overall active variety at 11%. Unaffiliated, which is exactly how it sounds, it's an entity external to the organization that's not affiliated with organized crime or nation state, for example, at 9%. And then we've got some internal active varieties. 8% is end user and 5% is your developers. Okay, maybe they're committing an error and it's leading to a compromise of information. The end user could be phished and it's leading to a compromise of information, more specifically privacy data in this case. Then other at 1%, and then we've got internal doctor or nurse at 1%, former employees, which we code as external because at the time of the breach, if they are outside the organization, they're coded as external, but they may have knowledge of the organization from their days of employment. They're at 1%, and then state affiliated at 1%. Nation state, which is another big threat actor when it comes to espionage in particular, is not on here in terms of the top actor varieties in privacy breaches, but state affiliated is very similar to nation state. They're just not directly working for the nation state. So that's the A's, the first A of the A4 threat model. Now let's talk about the actions, okay, the verb of the sentence, if you will. 7 action categories that you can see here on your screen. Starting from the right-hand side to the left, let's go over these real quick. Environmental and physical. These are 2 actions that we don't typically see in the top 5. They're usually at the bottom in terms of the top of the overall 7 categories here. Physical attacks are your payment card skimmers. There are also attacks that involve things such as the US Capitol Hill riot that happened in January as a physical attack with a cyber component. When we look at the bottom left is error. Errors are committed by internal and partner actors, okay? Errors don't have a motive. They are simply put mistakes, and it leads to a data breach. Misuse is an action that's committed by internal and partner actors, okay? And this could either be on purpose, maliciously misusing something, or misusing something to get the job done. So there could be a motive there in terms of stealing data or destroying data, or could be just getting the job done and leveraging shadow IT. Now, misuse is defined more specifically as misuse or abuse of something that you've been granted trust to, your credentials, your data, your assets, the environment in terms of that. So again, it's internal and partner, and it can be malicious, or it can be simply just trying to get the job done that leads to a data breach. The top three that we see over time in data breaches, as well as what we'll see here for privacy breaches, tend to be social, malware, and hacking. Social is an action that's an external actor, for the most part, that's targeting an internal entity, such as an end user, through phishing. Typically, it's on the front end of an attack path. Hacking is the action of the threat actor. Typically, it's an external actor here. Malware is the function of the malicious software. Okay, so that's how the malicious software is functioning, its actions. Okay, maybe it's a spyware or keylogger type of malware. Hacking and malware tend to go hand in hand, although not all the time. Social hacking and malware can all be part of the same breach. In fact, when we look at VERIS, when we look at the DBIR, it's important to note that nothing is mutually exclusive of anything else. So you can have multiple actions in the same breach. You can have multiple assets, servers, and systems in the same breach. Okay, so if you look and you're adding up and it's exceeding 100%, that's because there's overlap. So actions, all right, the second A. Looking at the 3-year time frame here in actions and privacy breaches, okay, and these are 6 of the 7 actions. We don't have environmental on here because we're not seeing that in terms of privacy breaches. Hacking is number 1. Again, these are the actions of the attacker at 41%. Error, interestingly, is at number 2 at 30%. Now, earlier I said the top 3 are typically hacking and social malware. Here we see error rise to number 2 position in terms of privacy breaches. Social's at 16% and malware is at 13%. Okay, so those are the top 4, followed by misuse and your physical. Now, when we look at the action vectors in privacy, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, this is the actual pathway or the vector for the actual privacy breach. The top ones are showing up here as web application, which is a hacking action vector at 45%. Carelessness, which is an error action vector. Okay, you can think of somebody that's cutting corners, or they're sloppy in terms of what they're doing, or they're just not, maybe they're misconfiguring something and not paying attention. It's at 30%. Email, which is a social action vector, at 20%. LAN access, which is misuse action vector, at 6%. So it gives you an idea of the attack paths, or at least the pathways or the vectors more specifically in terms of privacy breaches. So action varieties. Okay, so this aligns right underneath the actions and privacy breaches. So as we look at this, we're looking at 4,217 different privacy breaches for the 3-year time frame. And at number 1 out of 3 times, roughly at 30%, is use of stolen credentials, which is a hacking action variety. That is number 1. And historically, it's been in the top 2 or 3 that we've seen over the years. Typically, number 1 would be phishing. As you can see, it's number 3 on the list here. So use of stolen credentials and phishing are always up there at the top, right? And if you think about it, it makes sense. So if you have the credentials, you're going to use those to gain access to the environment. If you don't, then you're going to phish your way into the environment by targeting the human element. You may also brute force, and you can see brute force here is at 3%. So those are entryways into the environment. Or maybe in the case of use of stolen credentials, once you're in the environment, maybe you've got additional credentials that grant you additional access into the environment. So 30% is use of stolen credentials. Phishing, which is a social action variety, at 18%. And then the burger and fries of error, misconfiguration, and misdelivery. This is exactly what it sounds like. Misconfiguring something that leads to a breach at 12%, and misdelivering something such as an email or maybe even a mailer to the wrong recipient, like old school mail, at 12%. Privilege abuse is a misuse action variety, and then ransomware is at 5%. Ransomware is now firmly into the breach realm. We're seeing this in the DBIR, where of all the breaches that we looked at this year, 10% of them involve ransomware. So that's a dual extortion, where there's a layer of ransomware encryption, for example, plus there's been exfiltrated files before that encryption took place, and now the threat actor has 2 options. You've got the ransomware piece for the victim to pay potentially, as well as to contact the victim and say, I've exfiltrated your data, pay me or release it to the public. So these are the actions that we're seeing. Again, the controls are on the left-hand side here. There's a lot of the 18 controls here because we're pretty much covering all different avenues here in terms of the 7 action categories. So the third A, this is the assets. Which assets were affected? 7 asset categories moving from right to left. We've got media, and this is your external hard disk drives, your flash drives. It's also paper documents, okay? And we will typically see media somewhere in the top 4 or 5 of the overall 7 action categories. It really does depend on the industry. For example, healthcare, we see media a lot higher because there's often mailers that go out to patients or even employees, I guess you can say, but patients where the mailings have been out of sync in terms of the address labels and the contents, and the wrong people receive the wrong mailings, and thus there's an exposure of patient data or medical data. That just is an example there. Embedded in terminal, we don't see too much anymore. It's still there, but this was pretty significant when PCI attacks were occurring at the brick and mortar level. Now we have EMV check technology in place, so there's less attacks there, more attacks with e-commerce and web applications, but we still track terminals and embedded. Network devices are your routers, for example. Those tend to be in the top 4 or top 5 of the 7 action asset categories. They flip-flop depending on the industry, again, with media. The top 3 in this order are servers, persons, and user devices. Those are the top 3 typically across the board when we're looking at industries and overall breaches. And you'll see here for privacy breaches where they stack up. Number 1 is server at 84% for the 3-year time frame. Okay, and that makes sense, especially for privacy breaches, because a lot of that data is going to be on a server somewhere, a database server, for example. So over 8 out of 10 times we're talking about servers. And that aligns with what we're seeing in overall data breaches for the DBIR in terms of server being number 1, very similar frequency at 84%. Persons at 19%. Okay, these are people being targeted. We do include people as assets, 1 out of 5 times at 19%. By the threat actors who are committing privacy breaches. And then user devices at 11%. That's typically the person's user device. So if you can think of phishing with maybe a Trojan dropper that comes as a result of clicking on a hyperlink, the user device is also compromised. Media is at 10%. Here it's number 4. We also see kiosk terminal at 1%, and then network statistically they're tied at number 5, but it's actually slightly behind kiosk and terminal at 1%, and then embedded at 0%. So these are the assets and privacy breaches. Let's look at the asset varieties and privacy breaches. So these are the top ones. And really, if we look across all 7 assets, there's dozens of different types of assets. These are just the top ones that we're seeing. And I think I've pulled out here the top 9 or 10. So for the 3-year time frame, web application servers are number 1 at 46%, followed by mail servers at 33%. Again, this aligns with the DBIR in terms of the overall data set when we're looking outside of just privacy breaches. But database servers are at the 3rd place here at 15%. So it's much higher in terms of privacy breaches than it is to overall breaches. And that makes sense. That's where the privacy data would be stored. And then we get into other at 13%, and then desktop or laptop, which is a user device at 13%. And then the documents, which is media, there at 10%. That's the example I used with old school documents, paper documents that are mailed to the wrong recipient, or maybe those documents are lost and somebody maybe they're left on a subway train and somebody finds those and all that patient data was exposed. So that's assets. So let's look at attributes. How were the assets affected? We use the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, by very definition, within VERIS and DBIR, if there is a confirmed compromise of data, meaning it was exfiltrated, for example, confidentiality is impacted at 100%. So we would expect to see 100% there for breaches, all right? Not so much for incidents, because if that was 100%, it would be a breach. When we look at integrity, this is where we start seeing a little bit of a difference. We're going to see integrity pretty high for breaches, but it can also be high for incidents. Availability is where we see incidents typically with a higher percentage or frequency than breaches, because this is your denial of service attacks and ransomware incidents where there wasn't a breach, for example. So let's look and see what it says. Each one of these categories says for privacy breaches. So first and foremost, confidentiality, right? This is shown by the types of data that were compromised within privacy breaches. So your top figure there, I've got confidentiality highlighted at 100%, okay? So that's a data breach. The bottom chart there is data varieties and privacy breaches. So this is the same figure that we saw earlier in the day when we were talking about data varieties just in general. So this is showing you for the 1-year time frame how they stack up, with personal there at 91%, followed by credentials banking or credentials medical bank and payment. Okay, so the key controls there: your data protection, your audit log management, your malware defenses, and your network monitoring and defense. So that's confidentiality. That's the first C, or the first of the CIA triad. Let's look at the I, the integrity. So when we're looking at privacy breaches for the 1-year time frame, 1/3 roughly at 29% involve integrity. Okay, so integrity loss includes unauthorized insertion, modification, or manipulation of something. Okay, and the controls there you can see on the bottom left. So on the center bottom is the integrity, varieties, and privacy breaches. So this is interesting from the standpoint of, we've seen some commonality over the years, but we've seen a little bit of shifting and changing. So first and foremost, software installations at 56% for this previous year. Over 1 out of 2 times, or half the time, is software installation being involved. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the ability by the threat actors to install software onto the system. Okay. Alter behavior is impacting the integrity of a person at 41%. This is the flip side of the social breaches coin, where there's a phishing email, for example, that was sent out, and the end user was tricked into clicking on the hyperlink, and it led to a data breach. So that person's behavior was altered. It's just one of the examples of alter behavior. Now, interestingly, over the 7-year time frame that we looked at in terms of the data, when we looked at just purely financially motivated breaches, and we looked purely at espionage motivated breaches, these were the top 2 integrity varieties in that order: software installation and alter behavior. It didn't matter if the threat actor was committing espionage or a financially motivated breach. Software installation was number 1, alter behavior was number 2. Now, when we look at this year's DBIR, regardless of the motivation, we saw that alter behavior actually pulled into the first place, followed by the software installation. And a lot of that has to do with the rise in social breaches given the COVID-19 era, because we've actually seen social attacks or social actions increase by 11%, from 25% to 36% this year in overall breaches. So interestingly, alter behavior is number 1, followed by software installation when we look across the data breach data set. When we look specifically at privacy breaches, we see software installation at number 1, followed by alter behavior at 56% and 41%. Modified data at 22%. And then fraudulent transaction at 8%, and you can see modified configuration and misrepresentation at 7%. Now, the misrepresentation, a lot of that may go hand in hand with business email compromise, with misrepresentation occurring there. In fact, when we look at the DBIR, we see misrepresentation in 4th place. Here we see misrepresentation in statistically in 6th place. Okay, so these are the attributes in terms of integrity varieties. We covered confidentiality and integrity. Let's look at one last attribute, the A, availability in privacy breaches. So availability is at 12%, okay? And the varieties, you can see the breakdown there. Obscuration at 64%. So what is obscuration? Well, obscuration is simply, you can think of ransomware and encryption, and the files are obscured, you can't read them, therefore you don't have them available to use, okay? It's a good example of obscuration. Good reason why obscuration is at 64%, because we're seeing a rise in ransomware breaches. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, ransomware breaches are at 10% of overall breaches this year, and we really started to see ransomware breaches take off in 2018 as a breach and not just an incident. Loss is at 34%, which is number 2. Okay, and this makes sense because availability includes the loss from the standpoint of destruction, deletion, movement, performance impact, and or interruption. So loss would be losing your laptop, losing your mobile device, and it leads to a breach or a compromise of the data at 34%. And then we've got degradation, interruption, disruption, or destruction and acceleration there at the bottom. Okay, so the key findings, and we'll go into some Q&A here shortly. So in terms of motives, when we look at the overall threat actors, we saw that motives were dominated in terms of financial. But when we look at the internal actors here, we can see 66%. It does drop down from 94%, I think, was the overall actors, regardless of who they were. But when we look at internal, it drops to 66%. But we see fun rising to 16% from, I think, 2% for overall actors. So the internal actors' motives are financial, followed by fun. When we look at discovery methods, actor disclosure was number 1 at 28%, followed by security researchers at 16%. And then if we look at the actors for the first of the A4 threat model, 59% of the time we're talking about organized criminal elements. A lot of times their motivation is aligned with that financial motive. In fact, most of the time it is. And we're looking at 59% of the time it's organized crime, followed by an internal actor variety there, 11% of the time, which is system administrator. When we look at actions, we see that the top actions were use of stolen credentials at 30% of the time, okay, followed by phishing at 18%. Now, for the DBIR, we're going to see phishing at the top for the overall breaches, but here we're talking specifically privacy. It's use of stolen credentials at 30%. And just to kind of illustrate where these credentials are coming from, they could be from that same attacker from a previous breach into the environment. They could be from another attacker who breached the environment and sold that access to another attacker. They could be from a fake website that was set up by a threat actor, and they harvested credentials, and they were using those credentials to attempt to gain access into the environment. They do this because they understand that a lot of users use the same passwords across multiple accounts or similar passwords, and it's just rather trivial to then collect those passwords and attempt to use those to gain access into the environment. Now, one of the things that would help mitigate that or hopefully prevent it is to make sure that users are using strong passwords. You've got a good password policy. They're not reusing passwords. They're not using similar passwords. The other piece that would help mitigate and prevent that is, hopefully prevent, I should say, is multi-factor authentication. So if you're only using single-factor authentication and someone has compromised one of your users' credentials and they're using the same credentials for their enterprise account, that threat actor can be into the environment very easily. There's only one thing stopping them, and that's the credentials, and they have them. So if you have a second factor or multi-factor authentication where you have something you know, which is a password, something you are, which is biometrics, or something you have, which might be a token, that is really going to help mitigate things there. And then, of course, the phishing at 18%, that's educating folks to be wary of phishing emails, whether they be coming from emails or from text message, smishing, for example. Make sure that they're up on the latest campaigns in terms of threat actors and that they're able to recognize suspicious and malicious emails. Okay, the third A, assets. 46% of the time we're talking about web application servers, okay, in terms of targeted assets or compromised assets. Second to that is mail servers at 33%, and then third would be your database servers. And then finally, the attributes, looking just at the integrity attributes, alter behavior at 53% and software installation at 43%, keeping in mind that for overall breaches, it's software installation first and alter behavior second, but here we're talking just about privacy breaches. So the sys controls, there were 18 controls that I mentioned earlier. Here are those same 18 controls. So we went through the data from the data privacy exposure project that we had that was presented here today and looked at the key privacy controls. So first and foremost, data protection, which is SIS-3, would be a key control there, protecting your data. SIS-4 is secure configuration of enterprise assets environment. So this gets into cutting down on your misconfigurations and making sure that the assets and the software are configured properly to defend against those threat actor activities. SIS-6 is your assets control management. Okay, and this also involves your two-factor authentication. Malware defenses at SIS-10. This is going to really help in terms of the malware actions and cutting down on the impact of those. And then 12, 13, and 14, this is your network infrastructure management, making sure that you are managing your network infrastructure properly, monitoring and defending that for suspicious activities in terms of your network. And then finally, 14 there is your people training, getting people trained up on their skills, their awareness, their sensitization to detecting social engineering attempts, for example, and also sensitizing them to make sure that they report anything suspicious involving their system. So if you're interested in more in terms of the DBIR, the Data Breach Investigations Report, or the Varus Framework, here are some resources here. The DBIR is at the top link there. There's an interactive website on the second link. And then the third link there, DBIR Facts, Figures, and Data, is exactly that on GitHub. It's additional information beyond the report, or more specifically, it's the actual facts and figures and the data that underlie the report. VERIS Framework, VERIS A4 Threat Model, and VERIS Schema are in veriscommunity.net and GitHub. And then VERIS Community Database, VCDB, is actually an open source project where we are coding publicly disclosed breaches and incidents and making that data available to the public. It's the only contributor to the DBIR where you ever know who the victim was because it was already reported in the public. So you can use the VERIS web app to do that if you want to participate in VCDB, or you can use the VERIS web app to code your own incidents and breaches within your environment and compare and contrast to VCDB as well as the findings in the DBIR and as well as today's findings. And the VERIS coding style guide is at the very bottom. That's over 100 pages of walking through different publicly disclosed breaches and incidents and showing you how to code those using the VERIS web app and the VERIS framework. Okay, that brings us to the end. I think we may have some questions, so we'll open it up for some Q&A.
Thank you very much, John, for such an insightful and informative session.
You're very welcome.
That was a very interesting webinar, and we hope it was worth your time. Okay. Before we begin with the Q&A, I would like to inform all the attendees that this session is in sync with EC Council's CTIA program. EC Council's CTIA maps to many roles in the industry like threat intelligence analyst, threat analysis and reporting, vulnerability management and threat intelligence engineer, etc. Anyone with the CTIA certification is eligible for 9,000 plus job vacancies globally with an average salary of 1,70,000 per annum. If you're interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we'll reach out to you. So, John, shall we start with the Q&A?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first question is, it's by Yahi. Can Google and some email operators use artificial intelligence to detect fake emails before they reach the target?
I am not familiar with Google's capability there, but I would imagine that that is something that could be done to detect fake emails. What we're looking at most of the time when we're dealing with emails within the DBIR data set is emails that have slipped through and that are tricking the actual users into clicking. So there are other solutions out there that the users can go ahead and report the suspicious emails, but certainly if you do have some kind of AI ML protection in place to wick out as much email as possible, that is advantageous, and then you can have the user still be trained to recognize the fake emails or the spam emails, etc., and an ability for them to go ahead and report that.
Okay, thank you, John. The second question is by Tushar. What is proper way to guess your device is hacked?
Okay, you're breaking up. What is the proper way to, and I didn't hear the last part, Shilpa.
What is proper way to guess your device is hacked?
Oh, what is the proper way to guess if your device is hacked? Well, the best way is to detect an event before it becomes an incident or a breach. Now, in terms of how we've been called in to help out with customers that have been breached, sometimes the breach is detected by the dark web, and the dark web hunters are seeing indications that credentials have been exfiltrated and are being sold on the dark web, or maybe there are threat actors talking about the breach on a forum. That's one way. Another way that we see breaches being detected is through common point of purchase analysis or fraud analysis, or maybe even a law enforcement investigation. So when we're coming in, a lot of times the organization doesn't know they've been breached. External entities are discovering that. In terms of internal entities, there's various ways to discover if threat actors are in the environment. One of the ways is through suspicious traffic that's abnormal, that's out of the ordinary. Maybe it's late night traffic, maybe it's traffic that's encrypted that shouldn't be on a particular part of the network. Maybe it's traffic that is involving different ports, or it's unusual in terms of that user and their activity. So traffic is another way to detect potential breaches or incidents. Looking at the systems themselves, sometimes the antivirus solution will kick off an indication that there is something suspicious on the system, maybe even detecting outright malware. Now, Now, when it comes to insiders and espionage threat actors, they tend to avoid detection for two different reasons. Insiders are avoiding it because they already have trust and privilege, okay, and they're doing something within the bounds of what was granted to them, okay, and they're very hard to detect. So one of the ways to detect them is through looking at suspicious activities, UAVA, user and entity behavior analytics, for example, or maybe sensitizing their coworkers to report if they are acting suspicious. Maybe they are working late hours, or maybe they are bragging about information that they shouldn't know, and it turns out that they hacked into the CEO's email. So insiders tend to be very difficult to detect. You have to look at behavioral analytics. They're not using malicious software most of the time. When we're looking at espionage threat actors, they're avoiding detection because they are not using, or they're not bringing malicious software into the environment a lot of times. They'll come into the environment and they'll live off the land, or they'll blend into the forest and use the tools that are already there. So you've really got to use suspicious traffic as a detection mechanism. You've got to do threat hunting in the environment to see if there's indications of threat actor activity from an espionage standpoint that hasn't been detected by traditional methods. So those are some of the ways that we see organizations detecting either external notifications, or they're using behavior analytics, or looking at suspicious traffic for the insider threats, as well as the espionage threat actors.
Thank you, John. The next question is by James. Can we block all phishing mail before we receive in our inbox?
Wouldn't that be great? The thing is, the threat actors are always changing their tactics and their techniques to avoid detection. So they may not be doing a spray and pray all the time. They may be targeting specific end users. Maybe they've doxed them. Maybe they've looked up on social media who they are, and they've crafted their emails in a way that it doesn't even involve a malicious software attachment. Maybe it's a simple email that's offering them a job, or offering them research into a project, and they're asking for that end user to click on a link, and it takes them to a website where they register for the website, add their credentials, and the threat actors are simply looking to harvest those credentials on the back end. So it looks totally legitimate. In addition, those everybody thinks of attachments as always being malicious from a threat actor. They may be inert, meaning it's a PDF document that gives you information on COVID-19. You download the document, you scan it with antivirus, nothing is coming up as malicious. And it turns out that there's information in the document that's helpful with a link to a website. The user goes to that website, and again, maybe their credentials are harvested. The other thing too with the threat actors, are constantly changing up their tactics in terms of who's sending the emails, so they're obscuring where that's coming from. So it's a constant battle to keep updating your intelligence holdings in terms of what those suspicious emails are, and feeding that into your tools to detect. So you can certainly block a lot of this, but you have to know about it to be able to block it. And there are things that can be done in terms of beyond the technical means, by training your users to recognize these types of tactics where the threat actors are looking to continue to gain access into the environment through trickery, through fake websites, for example.
Thank you so much, John, for the answer. The next question is by Alvin. Can single sign-on SSO serve as a single point of failure, and what mitigations can be used to threat the risk?
So single sign-on is definitely helps, makes the defenses more solid, more congruous, makes it easier for the cybersecurity folks. It isn't the be-all, end-all in terms of security. You have to have multiple layers in terms of protecting your organization. So that is one factor, but it's not the be-all, end-all.
Okay. The next question is by Dinesh. Is automated fuzz testing helps in privacy issue?
Can you repeat that? Is automated, and I didn't hear the rest of it, please.
Yeah. Is automated fuzz testing helps in privacy issue?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it one more time? Is automated pulse or pass or?
Fuzz, automated fuzz testing helps in privacy issue?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question. Maybe I can answer it later if you could send it to me. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, sure. I'll take the next question. What is the best software that can be used to proactively detect and block breaches?
So I can't advocate for any particular brand. One of the things that we do is threat hunting. So we would use, we're actually tool agnostic. We can use certain tools, EDR tools, for example, if the customer has those tools. So we take our forensic techniques and look in the environment at the typical evidence sources that we would collect, regardless of whatever tool we're using. Okay, and we would look at the endpoint systems, we do interviews, we look at the volatile data, we look at the network traffic, we'd actually look outside the environment at router traffic, as well as looking at the dark web in terms of detection. So that is what we use in terms of proactive. Now, some of the solutions that are out there are network detection and response, which looks at your network traffic. Okay, we actually have a tool for that to look at the traffic, look at the packets, derive net flow, etc. There's also endpoint detection and response tools. There's all kinds of different vendors out there deploy applets and servlets to those endpoint tools for detection, to a certain extent for blocking, as well as for collecting evidence for forensic investigations. Okay, and then you've got your SIEM and your SOAR tools, right, that pull in a lot of different data sources for your SOC for folks to block and detect in the first place. And then you've also got tools such as your data loss prevention or data leakage prevention tools, user and entity behavior analytics tools, where you're looking a little bit more into what's happening in terms of exfil traffic as well, and you can certainly block that as well and alert on that, as well as suspicious traffic involving entities and users and what they're doing. So there's a myriad of different tools to block, to detect, to respond to incidents and breaches out there. Again, we're tool agnostic, so we can adjust to any customer's environment. So we don't actually, evaluate tools per se. We're flexible enough to be able to do that.
Okay. Next question is by Piyush. Can you tell where and how can one find the dark web forums to know whether their organization data is for breach and is out for trade?
Okay, so I think the question has to do with dark web and finding out if data has been breached. So we do have dark web hunters that are out there looking on the dark web at the forums, at the different places where data would be posted for sale. So one of the indications could be a threat actor that's bragging about breaching an organization, or maybe they're actually selling their credentials or the data that was exfiltrated. So a lot of times we'll see that as the indicator that there's been a breach, and we'll be notifying our customers to let them know that they would likely need an investigation to occur in their environment to see if they've been breached. So the dark web is, it's not all nefarious on the dark web, but it is a place where the threat actors can interact with each other and sell the data or sell the access to the environment.
Okay, taking last two questions, John.
Okay.
Why did the attacks on health organizations increase in the last year?
That's a good question. So there's a couple different reasons. First and foremost, when we look at our DBIR data set, healthcare has always been well represented. Why? Well, there's mandatory reporting requirements for the breach of healthcare information. So we see healthcare represented much more so than a lot of the other organizations, such as manufacturing. Okay, so there's mandatory disclosure for that. There's also been an increase in ransomware hitting healthcare industry as well. In the old days, just a few years ago, healthcare was off limits in terms of the ransomwares. Now the ransomwares do not care. They're hitting any kind of industry. In particular, we're seeing healthcare, as well as here in the States, we see state and local government being hit. Now, a lot of that has to do maybe with resources, and they don't have enough resources to put in play or expertise to put in play in terms of defending against ransomware. Also, with healthcare, we're also seeing things such as an increase in social breaches, but we're seeing that across the industries. There's been an increase, as I mentioned earlier, of 11% from last year to this year in terms of the data set. A lot of that coincides with the COVID-19 era. Okay, and then finally, there's also, speaking of COVID-19, there's also fraud. There's a lot of fraud that goes on in terms of COVID from the standpoint of medical fraud, identity theft, as well as insurance fraud. So that's kind of a secondary follow-on or byproduct of the initial COVID-19 attack, where we're dealing with social breaches, but we're also now dealing with fraud, maybe even business email compromise. So a lot of different factors go in there for healthcare. And finally, in terms of, I'll swing back to the mandatory disclosure reporting requirements for healthcare, there's a lot, we still see this, and I used this example earlier, where healthcare may be sending out mailers to patients, and the envelopes and the labels are out of sync with the actual contents, and maybe they're out of sync by one person, and people receive other people's healthcare information in the mail, and therefore it's a data disclosure, and it's counted as a breach within a DBIR data set.
Thank you, John. I'll take the last question. This question is by Yahi. Every time I tell my colleagues to keep their personal information and not share it with anyone, but they refuse and say we have nothing to worry about. How do we explain to them that this information is dangerous?
Absolutely. So it kind of reminds me of some of the arguments I've heard in the past, where people say that, I don't need to protect my computer system. I don't have anything to hide. Well, those computer systems can be compromised and used to hack or attack other computer systems. So that's a good reason there. But you want to protect your healthcare information. You want to protect all of it as much as possible, because that could lead back to fraud, identity theft, healthcare theft, or healthcare fraud, I should say. So you want to take steps to make sure that you're protecting your privacy information in general, and especially your healthcare information.
Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, John, for answering those questions and for great presentation and the knowledge shared to our global audiences. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward for more and more sessions with you. Before we conclude the webinar, would you like to give a message to our audiences?
I just wanted to say, everybody, please be well, be safe. Happy to link in with you. If you want to link in on LinkedIn, I'll be there. Just look me up. And thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you to all the attendees who have joined the webinar and took out time to be part of CyberTalk series and took part in the poll. And by this, we end the session. You may now disconnect your line. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.